Perfect. So is everybody able to see my screen? Give me a thumbs up or unmute just for a quick second. Awesome. Thank you,
Yep.
Miles. Perfect. All right, so tonight we're talking about prescribed fire prep and hazard mitigation. Again, my name is Cordy. I'm the prescribed fire program manager at Placer RCD. So tonight we'll be covering methods of fuel reduction that may influence your unit prep. That includes cut pile burning versus chipping versus mastication, basic terminology with unit prep, tools and equipment for effective line prep and hazard mitigation. Again, this presentation is not comprehensive, and unit prep is often dependent on your exact property and factors specific to that property's location, including elevation, aspect, all those good things. So to learn more, again, strongly encourage you to attend a training burn. So before you're considering prescribed fire, we're often always in the boat of doing fuels reduction. So on the left side, many of our properties look like this, with all, especially probably in 2 weeks, we'll be seeing a little bit more of this just with all the storm damage that we've gotten. We cannot put low intensity prescribed fire on the ground on units that look like this. So we have to move to the right, where we start to do cut, pile, and burning, which is something that, which is a method that I strongly encourage folks to do before they put fire on the ground. So fuels reduction, we often talk about thinning from below. It's the process of removing smaller undergrowth and disposing of it. Usually I tell landowners, especially if they're dealing with really dense forests, like most of us, given all of the fire suppression that we've dealt with, take out everything with loppers that you can handle with loppers first, cut, pile, burn it, take a step back, look at it, remove everything 6 inches and below, take a look at it, save some of the trees that the species that you want to save, but otherwise most of it can go. Our forests are way overcrowded, which makes them vulnerable not only to wildfire, but also to pests. Fuels reduction often comes in different flavors. So we call it removing, reducing, or rearranging. So removing the fuels directly, that's obviously the best, cut, piling, and burning, and pile burning, or if you're able to chip a lot of the fuels into a dump truck and dispose of it that way. A lot of folks are unable to do that, either for financial restraints or because they live within city limits, which have smoke restrictions. So other tactics include broadcast chipping, mastication, lopping, and scattering. All of these are great entry tools, but they should be followed up with prescribed fire, especially in our fire-dependent ecosystem. So again, rearranging is chipping. You still have the same woody material, it's just now in a different form. Some people broadcast chip, others I know create these larger piles. I've received feedback from experienced folks that actually piling the chips, despite that it's not very aesthetically pleasing, is actually a good way to reduce the wildfire hazard on a broader scale on your property. If you're able to do this, you can follow up with prescribed burning by basically cutting line around these piles and being able to burn around it. You obviously still have this big, large pile of woody debris on your property, which not everybody loves. So mastication is another really popular method that we're dealing with. Again, these are great entry tools. I'm going to cover a little bit more about prescribed burning following mastication later in the presentation. There's definitely some nuance to it, but again, these are great entry tools. You're just rearranging the fuels, though they're not removed from the property. They still pose a wildfire threat, especially if a fire comes through. It creates so much heat on the ground that it really kills your soils, and it can kill trees from the base. So you have to follow up with something else. And so we know that we have proof that mechanical thinning is not enough. It has to be followed up with burning. This is an image from the bootleg fire in Oregon. And you can see very clearly, right, the right side, no treatment, completely devastated forest. The left side, mechanical thinning only. I would argue still a pretty devastated forest. Now you're left with a ton of large trees that have to be, are incredibly costly and labor intensive to remove, and still pose another wildfire threat. You have a bunch of dead trees. So that middle ground in the middle of the photo where there's thinning and prescribed burning, that's a resilient forest, and that's what we're all aiming to do. All right, so getting into the content of what you guys joined me for is unit prep. And I love this photo. This is a burn we did just a few weeks ago up in Colfax on the ridge. It was about 2 acres and spanned the ridge top. It was very tidy looking. And again, we see a road on the left side, containment lines down on this forefront, as well as the backside of the burn. So I use the term containment lines, also known as fire breaks or control lines. These are areas that will not allow fire to spread. They can be constructed by hand. They're also naturally occurring. The width and quality of your fire break is determined by the conditions of the fuels and in part seasonality. If it's drier or a more hazardous, riskier, higher complexity burn, you want wider containment lines. But rule of thumb, what we're aiming for is 4 feet in width. And so that's usually, I have terrible depth perception, so I usually tell people, go off of the handle of your tool. So that's a good way of knowing that you've put in a solid fire break. And so natural fire breaks, these are also all over our properties. It can be streams and rivers, anything where fire will not carry. It can be used to support your containment lines or fire breaks on your units. It also reduces any type of labor that you have to put in on the ground. So fuel breaks. So fuel breaks are areas where fuels have been reduced. The RCD and also many other landowners and state agencies are putting in shaded fuel breaks. And all that means is that a lot of the understory has been removed. We still have a shaded canopy. And what that does is it prevents a lot of brush from moving in to replace the trees. It also is still resilient to wildfire. It's how our forests were historically structured. And so fuel breaks are different from fire breaks. So in this photo, we see a fire break, which is the road, and it moves through a fuel break in which there's fewer ladder fuels, there's less risk of a wildfire coming in and transitioning from a surface fire into a crown fire. All right, check lines. So sometimes this can be a confusing concept to folks. So check lines are different than containment lines. They're containment lines that temporarily stop the spread of the fire or basically give the fire practitioner a little bit of time to make any type of tactical adjustment. It's not as thorough as a finished containment line. Usually we aim for about 1.5 feet or 2 feet in width. Check lines also can be established with the use of water, but that's often more common in grassy fuels. A lot of the folks that we work with tend to be in mixed conifer forests, and so the check lines need to be established by hand. Check lines are also a great way of being able to achieve more acreage without compromising or sacrificing any type of ecological benefits. So a lot of what the RCD aims to put on the ground is low intensity, low complexity prescribed fire, safe, legal, and ecologically beneficial. That's our big motto. And so if you can put backing fire down on the ground where you're generating very low flame lengths, less than 2 feet in height, this little diagram that I drew up right before the presentation helps kind of establish that concept. And if anybody has questions, feel free to speak up after I explain this image so that we don't have to wait to the end, because sometimes people do get confused. So here's our little house. Here's our unit. we have wind coming from this direction. This image is not oriented, so I'm not going to use any type of, well, I did say aspect east, so I guess it's coming from the east. So we have a fire break on the top. We're backing fire down the slope. We have another fire break at the bottom. Let's say this unit is 3 acres. You're having a hard time spreading the fire. You're unsure that you're going to get the 3 acres done in the time that you have. What we can do is put a check line in the middle of the unit. You back fire down the top of that first unit. You make sure you have enough depth. And then you can basically start backing fire down the bottom of the unit. And so you have 2 units burning simultaneously. The bigger concern would be that your second unit, your lower unit, jumps the check line and runs up, but that's also why we ensure that there's been enough depth has been achieved in this top unit before we light the bottom unit. And so again, this is a way of achieving more acreage without sacrificing any type of the ecological benefits, without putting a ton of fire on the ground, and keeping the heat really low. So this happened to us just a few weeks ago where we had a check line in our unit. And we realized the morning of, we just did not have the personnel in order to achieve both units, especially because our lower one had a lot more denser fuel bed. And so what we did was we reinforced our check line. And again, these check lines are able to provide that thought process and time to say, I need to make a tactical adjustment. Things aren't exactly the way I anticipated them to be. We can still burn safely. We can still achieve acres that morning. So I mentioned wetline, and again, often these are used in grass fires. So fuels are light enough where they're quickly extinguished with water. You can also light with a hose. So I have my coworker over here. Let's say we were burning that grassy unit. You could light it with the hose and then light fire off of that wet line. So again, in lighter fuels, especially with winds, we call them 1-hour fuels. If you're using a wet line, I like to call them about 20-minute fuels. You want to re-wet about after 20 minutes to make sure that fire won't get in there. This burn was actually targeting deer grass. So we hosed around, we laid water around these deer grass clumps, and then we just lit them off. So they stayed really contained and they didn't spread farther than we wanted them to. Okay, so pulling back is one of the more laborious aspects of unit prep, especially with placer PBA. So pulling back just means removing fuels away from anything of value. It could be a natural resource, such as a valued tree, something that could cause problems like a stump, or anything of value, man-made infrastructure, things like that. So sometimes we get questions like, hey, I have this propane tank right in the middle of my unit. We have burned around propane tanks. It takes a lot for them to heat up, but you always want to make sure that you're completely down to mineral soil around anything of value. So we also, if you notice in the background, there's a madrone tree. This landowner in particular wanted to save this madrone tree. You can see that fuels were removed from around it. And because we also removed fuels away from this propane tank, we didn't get a lot of heat, convective heat moving uphill once we backed the fire down. So you can see on this right photo, here's the fire coming towards all of this prep work, no issues whatsoever, which is good. So if failure to pull back can also cause issues to your trees. So in this photo, this is where fuels were not pulled back and fire was allowed to enter into the base of this oak and basically burned it from the inside out. So this tree was wildlife habitat, but also not more importantly, but probably more importantly, at least equally as importantly, it's a safety issue. So especially when you're dealing with any type of structurally vulnerable trees, snags, dead or dying trees, we do not want fire getting into those. It requires a skilled practitioner in order to take them down. Many times in community burning, you're dealing with folks who either have not been on a fire ground before or have very little experience on the fire ground. The last thing you want to do is be removing a tree or having a tree that's vulnerable at failing and having folks near it. So that's one of the biggest reasons why we tell folks to pull back. So here's another example. These are also all images that we really just want to trigger a memory as you're walking through your own properties, like, hey, I remember this, I should pull back from this tree. And cat faces or any type of wounds are one of those. Pitch pockets are another. So especially with trees that are fighting against bark beetle, we'll start to get these pitch pockets. Sometimes you'll see weeping trees that are basically sap is completely running down the side of the tree. If fire gets into those pitch pockets or pitch lines on that tree, it'll run up really quickly. Sap and pitch is incredibly flammable. You do not want fire crawling up to the top of the tree and causing larger issues, especially when you have folks working on the ground. When in doubt, just pull back. It doesn't take very long. We tell folks to pull back between 18 inches and 2 feet, or a foot, probably 12 inches to 18 inches. If you have trees that are more vulnerable to heat that you want to save, such as madrones, you want to pull back more. So again, defects can be quite small. So you want to be really focused when you are working on your unit. I also strongly encourage folks who are working with community members or neighbors, make sure you address these types of topics at the beginning of your briefing. Make sure everybody's on the same page, like, hey, this is what I'm looking for. This is why I want to pull back. And that way, as somebody who is leading the burn, you are responsible for seeing everything, but everybody's responsible for seeing everything. And so it's really impossible for just one person to be able to be everywhere at once. So it's helpful to make sure everybody in your group knows, okay, I see a defect, I'm going to pull back, or regardless, I'm going to pull back from any tree that hasn't been. Rotting stumps is another issue folks are dealing with on their properties. So especially when they're directly next to a living tree, you want to pull back from that rotting stump because fire will cook inside there for a long period of time. It'll also generate a lot of smoke. The roots underneath will kill that other residual tree from underground. And so that's why we always encourage pullback. You're also dealing with stumps that are adjacent to containment lines. So see how this was a stump that burned out. We were fortunate it did not spot on the other side, but basically what can happen is if you have these stumps close to your containment line, they can burn down, and then the roots can catch fire underneath your containment line and then light the other side. And so always pull back from stumps that are close to your containment lines. So in this image, here's our containment line or our fire break. The log and the stump would both require pulling back here, right? Because the proximity to the proximity to the containment line means that there's a higher probability or risk of it jumping to the other side and causing a problem. So a lot of the previous photos that I showed are based off of units that have been prepped using cut, pile, and burn tactics. So chipping and mastication, because there's now a lot more heat on the ground, all of those trees that you chipped are now just in a different form on the ground. You do have to be a little bit more careful about mitigating heat. And so this is where chipping has occurred. Again, you want to get the chips away from the base of the tree. Otherwise, it could cook it from the base and kill a tree that you maybe didn't want to kill. So snags, again, I brought this up earlier. I cannot emphasize enough. If you have a tree that's vulnerable to falling, snags are already dangerous and you don't want folks working around them. If you instruct somebody to work around them, make sure they understand to keep their head on a swivel. Snags can fall at any moment, and if they catch fire, it requires somebody with a lot of skill in order to take it down. This snag in particular is, in this photo, is a problem because of how close it is to the containment line, which is right here. And so if this snag caught fire, it would be much more likely to throw embers to the other side and cause a risk of escape. So when in doubt, pull back. We're usually working on fairly small scales, especially in community burning, less than 10 acres. And so if you have the people there, make sure they understand what their role is and pull back from these trees so that we don't have any issues. So masticated units are also come with a lot of nuance. So as you can see, this is a masticated unit we burned a couple years ago. It does not consume a ton of the fuel on the ground. It only catches the surface fuels. And so that's why usually in masticated burns, we do a process called phase burning, which means it will take multiple burns in order to actually get rid of that fuel. You definitely want to pull back from the trees. There's a lot of heat there at the base. We aim to have prescriptions that are nice and cool, cloudy, shaded fuel beds. Again, the prescription usually does depend on what fuel was masticated. So I'll show some photos of masticated buckbrush, which is also known as Wesley's ceanothus. This was just masticated old conifers and small undergrowth, but a lot of folks also masticate manzanita. People are dealing with a ton of monocultures of manzanita. Those will not decompose, or they will, it just will take a long time. Generally with masticated buckbrush, which I'll show photos of, it only takes a few days of drying. It dries out much quicker. Whereas if you're dealing with masticated manzanita, you have a longer timeline of drying before you can put fire in order to start eliminating them. So as I mentioned, those larger pieces are not going to be consumed in masticated materials, and we do a process called bone piling. So after the flaming front has passed through, we are able to grab some of these larger pieces of wood, and you can create burn piles. And that is one of the better ways of consuming a lot of the larger things that won't be consumed during your prescribed burn. And we do that whether it's been masticated or not. So given the state of our forest, there's often a lot of fuels that are 10 or 100 hour fuels that are not getting consumed in these low intensity prescribed burns. Wait until that flaming front has passed through. Now it's nice and cooled off, and then you can start bone piling and creating these pile burns, and they're super safe because they're inside an entirely blacked out unit. So building line and masticated fuels is very labor intensive. We had a small workshop a couple weeks ago. It was a training burn where we burned masticated buckbrush, and we had all of our volunteers build the containment lines, especially because masticated fuels, sometimes folks till it into the soils. If you're following that up with a prescribed burn, you just have to make sure that when you're digging those containment lines, that you're actually getting all of those fuels removed and you're getting your containment lines down to mineral soil. It's very helpful to have a team of people. If you're somebody who is using mastication in their long-term management plan or has used mastication, I strongly encourage reaching out for volunteers and community members to help you as you're building these lines. They're very labor intensive. So prescribed burns following mastication are also a labor-intensive process. So we call it a pretty intense tree-to-tree engagement. And when you're burning masticated fuels, you just need to make sure you're managing the heat consistently. So again, this is that masticated buckbrush that I mentioned earlier. We also call it shredded wheat. It dries out quite quickly. It generates a lot of heat. It's very aerated, which means it also creates a lot more heat and fluffs up. So it creates a pretty high intensity burn. And so when you're backing, so we backed fire down this masticated unit. In order to manage the heat, you can because it's burning in phases, your the lower portion of your duff layer or masticated layer should still be wet. What you can do is with a hand tool, mix it up with that cooler material that helps manage the heat. You can directly put water on the spot that's generating too much heat. Oftentimes with masticated units, we have to just straight up remove some of the fuel until the flaming front has passed. And then we can do that bone piling method where you're creating a burn pile inside your prescribed burn unit. So line construction, I showed folks working with tools in order to put lines in on that masticated unit. Tools are absolutely going to work. Tools and hand labor. If you are one person that's kind of a lone wolf and doing your own thing, that's great too. In order to make it easier for you, this probably wouldn't work in masticated material, but you can use ordinary tools, leaf blowers, weed whackers, rakes, and loppers to create the same line that could be created with hand tools. So we really just emphasize keeping it simple. Leaf blowers are great also for doing that fuels reduction around the base of trees that you want to keep. Leaf blowers are good for doing the final touches in the morning of your burn, or using a rake. In this photo, also notice that this stump should have been raked around. It's right next to our containment lines. So propane torches are also really good tools, especially in rocky or muddy soils where hand tools can be really difficult, especially when you bring them down and hit a rock and it goes through your back. But this is a photo where we're building the line for a burn that's going to happen later in the year. So usually it's a range improvement burn. You do it in the springtime, you're targeting invasive species. If you are using a propane torch, again, you're having fire on the site, you should always also have water available. Propane torches are also really good for spot burning manzanita shrubs, especially where fuels are too sparse to support a prescribed burn. So given how wet and cool our winter has been, we've been doing a lot of prescribed burnings, but they've been what we call dirty burns, where we're not getting a ton of great consumption. And also we're already getting a fair bit of green up. So that green up combined with cool weather and sparse fuels means that we're not able to target a lot of our manzanitas or smaller shrubs that we want to target with prescribed burning. And that's where this propane torch comes in handy. You can just spot burn it and take care of them right like that. So as I mentioned, weed eaters are great for rapid line construction. A lot of folks have to deal with mountain misery or bear clover. It's also called kit-kadizzy. It's quite a flashy fuel when it does burn because of all the resins in it. And it can be difficult to construct a line in it by hand. So these weed eaters are really great tools, especially if you're able to get a weed eater with a steel blade. Those are good for this kit-kadizzy. They're also really good for Himalayan blackberry if you're trying to construct a line or burn blackberry. So again, weed eaters, leaf blowers, they're all good for getting rid of some of these fuels around the trees that we don't want to burn up. And use the tools in combination. It's going to take a few different passes on the containment line, but in the end, it'll be less labor intensive and it will hurt your body less. And so we usually first take the lines down with a weed eater. We get all of the larger stuff. Then we can either spot burn it with a propane torch or rub out some of the woody material with either a Pulaski or McLeod. And then you can leaf blow or rake any of the remaining fuels to clean off the line and make sure it's down to bare mineral soil or rock. So another hazard that folks should keep in mind, especially because I don't know anywhere in the Sierra foothills that's flat, we're dealing with rolling material and burning material. So this was a burn actually that happened a few months ago where I was walking the line after we burned it, and the containment line did exactly what it was supposed to do. This burning pine cone rolled off the unit and landed in the containment line. The slope was not super severe in this burn, and so we did not do any type of cup trenching, but the containment line was able to still catch and arrest that burning material. If you do have really steep slopes, you want to make sure that you either turn anything that could roll, like logs, perpendicular to your slope, like this, as so, and or trench the trench below where any rolling material is, and it prevents anything from rolling out. These are containment lines where we do cup trenches because it's a much steeper slope. The concern would be that rolling material would roll past your containment line down onto a lower unit, light the fire there, and fire would run up slope, which would create a dangerous situation. These cup trenches are able to then catch any of that rolling material and ensure that your lower unit does not light. So winter blacklining, this is another type of preparation method, especially for folks who are targeting springtime burns. Springtime burns are reserved for invasive species management. So a lot of folks have to deal with star thistle, for example, barbed goat grass, things like that, where if you're managing these species or trying to eradicate them with fire, you need to target them in the late spring, early summer, ideally, of course, before the burn ban is implemented. So winter blacklining is a method used in order to better secure your unit and make sure that it's as safe as possible. And so in this photo, this area at the background will be targeted for a springtime burn. The containment line is not seen in this photo. It's basically behind the photographer. And what's happening is we're targeting these areas underneath the trees, both to reduce any type of heat mortality that would occur in the spring, but also to increase the depth of that containment line. So now there's even less risk of any type of escape or issues if you're lighting a springtime burn. So folks use roads also as containment lines. Again, in this photo, the containment line is being blacked in. Additionally, that now adds another 4, 6, 8 feet to your containment line. It ensures that you have less risk of an escape for a future burn where conditions are hotter and drier. So last thing is water is the simplest part of unit prep. You should always have it, and you can never have enough of it. So water comes in many different forms for folks who are more out in the boonies and don't have access just to a regular hose bib on a home for defensible space burns. There are fairly simple ways of equipping and rigging up a pickup truck. We're actually going to have a speaker coming in a few weeks who works in El Dorado County, and he's a homeowner there, and he's built a great little rig. So he's going to go through some of the costs and benefits of that. Also backpack pumps. These things usually run somewhere around $200, but they're available for free, both through the Placer PBA as well as through the Yuba Bear Burn Cooperative for anybody who's up in Nevada County. Great, so I guess I'll take questions now. This is my contact information. For folks who are interested in learning more about workshops or educational events or demonstration burns, please contact me to get on the listserv. For until June, so until my funding runs out, I actually am available to do technical assistance site visits in areas outside of Placer County, but my primary focus is Placer County. And we're working on increasing our equipment cache in order to give landowners greater access to the tools that they need in order to conduct safe, legal, and ecologically beneficial burns. So I strongly encourage you to attend a training burn. It's the best way. It's the best way of learning. I am constantly learning on these burns, and again, just strongly encourage it. So with that, I didn't see any questions, I don't think. But if anybody wants to take them, if they have questions, please take yourself off on mute and feel free to speak up. No. Oh, here's the chat. You're welcome, Miles. So if there's any, is there anything that I did not cover that folks expected to get covered? Otherwise, otherwise we can always end it a little bit early. All right. If there is no questions, I will let you guys get back to staying warm, and I hope that everybody stays really safe during this upcoming storm. And I really look forward to seeing some of you at Burns in March. Thank you guys so much.